back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris. I'm your instructor for this course. And tonight we're going to be recording the second part of this lecture for Chapter 19, A United Body of Action, 1900 to 1916. We're going to pick up where we left off on the last lecture, talking about progressives on the color line. We're going to be talking about two people we've talked about in the previous lecture. We're going to be expanding our conversation on them. Ida B. Wells Barnett and W.E.B. Du Bois. We're not going to spend a lot of time discussing them because we've got a lot to cover in this second part. And hopefully we'll get done with the second part and this will finish up Chapter 19 so we can move on to Chapter 20. So anyway, with that, let's talk about Ida Wells Barnett. As you remember, she was the one that was quite ahead of time, starting up an anti-lynching campaign. As you can imagine, an anti-lynching campaign at this point in American history, roughly 35 some odd years after Reconstruction, it's still a very noble intent, but lynching is still practiced at this point in time in American history a little too frequently. And we have to remember that lynching is not kept in the cover of darkness by men wearing hoods or in the secretive back roads of some swamp, like maybe we have this misconception. You will be staggered to realize where lynching is carried out, as many of the postcards that exist from this era clear up until the 1950s and 1960s demonstrate, and yes, they did have postcards of these activities, which is even more astounding that they documented these activities. Lynchings were actually practiced with way too much frequency, quite often out in the open, with onlookers, by people that were quite welcome to have their photographs taken without the cover of a hood. So there was quite some willingness to be open about what they were doing, and even more so to talk, obviously, about what they were doing and why they were carrying out these activities. So they were clearly aware of why they were carrying out what we now recognize clearly as miscarriages of justice. And for staggering reasons. I think I mentioned in the previous lecture, the one that stood out to me was the one postcard that actually documented a man that was lynched simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time when a little white girl was murdered, or presumably I should say murdered. And he happened to be on the wrong country road when he encountered the posse that was looking for somebody to essentially make pay for her death. And apparently the little girl had been seen earlier in the day talking to a young African American man. So the conclusion was therefore made that she had been murdered by said African American man. This poor fellow happened to be on a country road when this mob encountered him. So they grabbed him, snatched him away, and lynched him for her death. Now, first off, was she in fact murdered? Second off, was he in fact the same person who the little girl had been seen talking to. And lastly, was there even, the fact was, nobody knows what really transpired. And nobody would ever know. The only two people that really know was the little girl and the man she'd been talking to, and if there really was an assailant, the assailant who was involved, if there even was a crime that was carried out. It could very well be she died of natural causes. It could be also very possible that maybe she met with an unfortunate accident. But it was instantaneously concluded that she'd been murdered, and that the person that she'd been seen talking to earlier in the day played a part in her death. But that's the tragedy that underlie many of these lynchings. The other tragedy was the fact that sometimes these lynchings were carried out simply because these people were not wanted in the community as well. And the statement was made to get the families out of the communities. And the guise was, this person may have been involved in a crime, may have been involved in some, simple little miscommunication, and the charges were trumped up to get them out. It's horrible to realize the brutality of lynching. And that's what Ida Wells Barnett wanted to bring people's attention to with her anti-lynching campaign. However, reform groups didn't want to divide over race. Clearly, they knew that many of their supporters of these reform groups were leaning to the side of being pro-white. They were supremacists and had their feelings that they did not care to upset them. So ultimately, they did not want to divide their support. Also, we have to remember that eugenics endorsed white supremacy at this point in time. Many of these reformers were supporters of eugenics. Now, what's eugenics? We didn't really talk about this in discussing scientific racism, but eugenics was an emerging concept of this supreme race. And of course, when we're talking about this supreme race, I think you can kind of conclude here that the supreme race was presumed to be the white or Aryan race. Eugenics was pushing this notion that the white European race was seen as a superior race. So this idea of eugenics was born on, was popular. It was a popular theory, a popular emerging field. Obviously, we know eugenics isn't legitimate science. We've had this proven to us time and again. This was the idea that Hitler used behind his Nazi regime, and obviously we know that it wasn't true. But at that time, it was seen as the latest and greatest thing. But since it was popular at that time, needless to say that it did not, it had its supporters, and the supporters stood in opposition of Ida Wells' efforts to get legislation passed in support of an anti-lynching campaign. So ultimately, her efforts were way ahead of their time. Um, it would take many, many years before any efforts could be successful in getting such legislation passed. Then we have W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois, I mentioned in talking about Booker T. Washington, who you may remember was in support of racial accommodation. The idea that you have to be in work in conjunction with whites rather than trying to establish trying to fight for racial equality. Is this practical? Well, if you're trying to get true equality, just going along with the flow, just picking up table scraps isn't going to work. And obviously, this is the idea that Booker T. Washington, or I should say W.E.B. Du Bois, was pushing. How are we ever going to advance as a people when we're just picking up the table scraps, so to say? And that's true. How? How would you pick up and move forward? How would the African American people pick up and actually find true equality if they were just finding accommodation, as Booker T. Washington was advocating? Well, that's when ultimately he advanced this idea in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. Needless to say, his efforts did pay off. He went on to found the Niagara movement, which ultimately did lead to the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP as we know it, which has made tremendous strides for winning advancement towards and finding equality for African Americans. And obviously, we still have a long ways to go. We are nowhere near getting total equality, but we have made tremendous strides. And I know you're probably going to go, yeah, Professor, but as you will see throughout this course, and if you talk to your family and you begin to see what the way things used to be versus now, you're going to gain a whole different perspective of how bad things are now versus how bad things used to be. And we'll be talking more about, we've already talked about de facto and de jure segregation. Things have changed tremendously. Things were terrible, and I tell a story about a student that I had in my class a number of years ago when I first started teaching that I wish I could have had him speak to each of my classes that I've taught since, because he had a very compelling story about coming from the Deep South before civil rights and coming here, and it really put perspective on how bad things could be, and then coming into our situation here, in, of all places, Watts. before the Watts riots of the 1960s. But the way he did it, the way he framed it, was something that even I cannot do justice as a historian, because he spoke from living through the experiences of having been in that experience, and it's something that I just can't do justice. But the way he told it was compelling. But anyway, so now we talk about the struggles for democracy, the public response to the jungle, which is something I've been hinting at for a couple chapters now. Upton Sinclair's legendary book, I guess is the best way to put it. Maybe some of you have read it. Maybe some of you have heard about it. I used to assign it for this class, and I realized that it didn't quite have the impact that the jungle used to have. It's actually a critique of the conditions of Packingtown, and this book is staggering, to say the least. It's bleak. It's the best way to put it. And the content of it is unbelievable. And when it was written by Upton Sinclair, his intent behind the book was supposed to be to promote socialism, which, when you read the book, that's not what you're reading in the book. But that was his intent when he wrote The Jungle, was to promote socialism and how socialism is to correct the ills in society. But ultimately, what his book became was actually a scathing rebuke of how bad things were with our food supply, our producers, especially our Packingtown. And that's actually what outraged consumers and actually started this snowball effect with consumers, and actually found him in the Oval Office, because when Teddy Roosevelt read his book, he was incensed. TR actually called him into the Oval Office and wanted to know exactly how much of the book was real, how much of the accounts were actually real accounts, if there was anything that was made up about his accounts of the conditions in Packingtown, about how the animals were treated, how the workers were treated, what was true and what was fiction. And Upton Sinclair had done extensive research in Packingtown right before he wrote the book. He had gone in the slaughterhouses and all the conditions. He'd taken extensive notes. His research was thorough. So everything he'd written was accurate. Nothing was made up. Everything was precise. So when TR calls him into the White House and he's telling him all this, needless to say, his reaction is very visceral to these accounts. In fact, he's rather astonished that this stuff has been going on. And his response is that ultimately something has to be done. And the response that happens is actually these two pieces of legislation, which is the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Because ultimately, if you've read The Jungle, you realize that the accounts that are given are astonishing. There's downer animals, which are animals that are sick, that should not enter our food chain. And there's adulterated foods that have been heavily doctored with dangerous chemicals. So ultimately, this changes everything for us. How we come to patent medicines, all this stuff ceases because of these two, essentially these two key pieces of legislation. Everything becomes regulated and carefully regulated, and one of the ones with the Federal Meat Inspection Act actually comes into play very significantly about 20 some odd years ago, when we had something called bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Some of you may have heard of this, which was called mad cow disease. It went through Europe like wildfire. Essentially, it's a brain wasting disease that strikes cattle, but when it gets into human beings, it's extremely contagious disease, nasty disease. It causes a condition in human beings called Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome, which essentially causes the same illness in humans, but you stagger around and eventually you die a horrible, vicious death, painful, brutal death. But the reason it went through Europe with such rapidity was the simple fact that the European Union did not have these stringent protections on their food chain and screening the cattle the way we screen our cattle. So this disease manifests itself pretty quickly after infection in the cows. We see a cow exhibiting these symptoms, we take it out, it's euthanized. The European Union isn't quite as quick in responding necessarily. So the cows kind of slipped through before the disease was caught. Obviously, afterwards, they began screening their cattle more carefully, making sure that these sick animals didn't get through. Now we more carefully screen our cattle in light of this, just to triple check to make sure that no sick animals get through our food chain and potentially infect anybody, just to ensure our people that you're not going to get a sick cow. So it gives you an idea that we had protections in place, and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is responsible for these protections. When it comes to progressives in state and local politics, ultimately redesigning the city. Aldermen acted as bosses. We have to remember that the political machine was still alive and kicking at this point in time in history. Bribery and corruption were very common. They targeted vice primarily in working class neighborhoods. This is where you have the houses of prostitution, and eventually will have what's called a blind pig, which are the speakeasies of the Prohibition era, that will pay off the aldermen, and also, yes, law enforcement as well, because you got to keep those police from raiding your establishment. Yes, very common thing. Now, you do have reform mayors and cities that try to come in and clean up these cities. They push for 8-hour days for the workers, trying to get better conditions for the workers. They buy or regulate the utilities. That was another thing that was very common in these cities, these municipalities. The utilities were often trying to literally skin the citizens alive by charging them ridiculous rates if the cities were electrified, if they offered them fire protection services. They would literally try to squeeze every penny out of the citizens and charge them ridiculous rates. These reform mayors would buy and regulate these utilities so they weren't owned by private companies, they weren't privatized in any way, and they put them on schedules where there were flat rates so that everything was completely controlled. There was the City Beautiful movement, which was the idea of putting park spaces within the cities so that citizens had a leisure spot to go to that was open and free to the citizens, so that citizens didn't have to go away from their homes, very far from their homes, to experience a little slice of nature. And ultimately, they also looked at clearing out slums and tearing out slums and making it so that they could put in new housing for people. They also employed city planners to better utilize the space within cities to maximize the quality of life within the cities. We also have progressives at the state level as well, with urban reform was popular in the East, which we'll be talking about more. The Southern progressivism refined segregation and disenfranchisement. We'll be talking about that as well. Western states experimented with government, with the structure of government, and also the city layouts, which we'll be talking more about when we get to the 1920s, and how it differed dramatically from the East. Now we're going to concentrate on the executive branch against trust. And we open this up by talking about the assassination of William McKinley. Now, McKinley becomes the third president to be assassinated. We, of course, have Lincoln being the first, James Garfield second. So then we have McKinley. Now, McKinley is actually assassinated at the Pan American Exhibition in Buffalo, New York on September 6, 1901. He's shot there. He does not die until September 14th from complications of his wound that he suffers there. He's actually shot by an unemployed gentleman by the name of Leon Sezglowski. I'm probably butchering that name. He's an self-identified anarchist who lost his job in the Panic of 1893 and never got over that loss of his job. And ultimately, on the death of McKinley, his vice president takes over. Now, it's interesting to note who his vice president is. His vice president turns out to be a very young gentleman by the name of one Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, when he assumes office, will be the youngest president that we've had to date. Now, I say to date because he only remains the youngest president until we have a president assume power in 1960. That president is John F. Kennedy. So he's the youngest president for very long. So anyway, Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive. He believed in the power of government to make change. And he also revitalized the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we'll be talking about a little more about what he does to utilize that to his advantage. He also sought out reforming laws that intended to keep big business responsible, not break them up, which we'll be talking about a little more here in a minute. And the first thing he sets out to do in his presidency is handle the coal strike of 1902. Now, the owners refused to deal with the unions, so Roosevelt threatened the owners into a compromise. And the direct action made the federal government a force in labor disputes. Essentially, he forced them to deal with one another. And this action became the groundwork for what became known as his square deal. He made sure that everybody got a fair hand in their dealings. A square deal was what it became known as. Now, Roosevelt became known for stretching the limits of presidential power. And one of these was for ultimately conservation. He enlisted the assistance of Gifford Pinchot in helping him extend the number of national parks that we had under his presidency, and also the efficient management of our natural resources in the process. Of course, he also gets known for his infamous big stick democracy that he employs. And the idea behind it is to increase global trade and communication with the United Civilized Nations. And as he ultimately becomes known, he's willing to interfere with uncivilized nations, but he does not necessarily state it so nicely as that. Probably one of the most infamous dealings he gets tied up in is the dealing over Panama Canal, which we actually are able to get the Panama Canal built by involving ourselves in the conflict in Panama to kind of manipulate Colombia from, or I should say Panama from seceding from Colombia in order to finagle the building of the Panama Canal. And TR is instrumental in orchestrating that whole matter, even sending in forces to assist the Panamanians in breaking off from Colombia. Very dramatic maneuvering around. We have a lot of interventions that we do down in South and Central America to make things happen for us. Ultimately, there's a lot of economic and military intervention that we do down in South and Central America to that end. So with that, we're going to move on here. to Taft and dollar diplomacy. So we see the direct election of senators, the income tax and the corporation tax, and the antitrust enforcement emerging. And the antitrust enforcement that we see TR intervene is some trust busting that he intercedes with. Which goes to goes over fairly successfully. Sorry that I hesitated there for a minute, but actually it's very successful. He actually becomes quite known for his efforts with his trust busting as he becomes known. Ultimately, he does become successful in his trust busting efforts. He goes after the trusts that during that time of his presidency with his antitrust legislation that he undertakes. He did use economic, then when Taft comes to office, we see the efforts of dollar diplomacy utilized as well. Taft scores the same, utilizes the same strategies as well with his similar strategies. So he also uses economic power for diplomatic purposes. Now, this is where we get this idea of dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy is something we will continue to use for many years. Taft is somebody who TR handpicks to succeed him as president once he has served his terms. Taft is not as successful a president as TR was, but his methodology of using dollar diplomacy is a strategy that we will utilize beyond his presidency. So ultimately, we will go on to American landscape, the Hetch Hetchy Valley, for our final sections here in this chapter. As a potential water supply for the burgeoning San Francisco, the Hetch Hetchy Valley is a natural resource that will serve us well. It's 152 miles from San Francisco. It's this beautiful, lovely oasis of potential wellspring for San Francisco as a water source. It becomes a contest between conservation and use. Muir and Pinochet debate how to use it or how to conserve it. The primary entity leading movement to preserve the Hetch Hetchy is the Sierra Club. Ultimately, they do see to damming it up and using it as a reservoir. And the interesting thing is now they're talking about taking down the dam and restoring the Hetch Hetchy Valley back to its original splendor. Of course, what splendor there is, because it's been dammed for all this time, so it's going to take time for the valley to restore itself after being dammed for all this time. Then ultimately, rival visions of the industrial future. There's the new nationalism that sees the elimination of corporate campaign contributions, regulation of industrial combinations, tariffs set by commission, graduated income tax, banking organization, national workers' compensation program, and then ultimately the 1912 election. Woodrow Wilson was an economist, favored executive power, and he considered himself a progressive. Ultimately, the 1912 election is a fascinating one because Woodrow Wilson ultimately winds up winning the election because the Republican ticket gets split by Teddy Roosevelt running against the other Republican candidate. And when the Republican ticket gets split like this, it splits the votes for the one Republican candidate. And the election is ultimately thrown in favor of the Democrats. And by doing this, it's unfortunately, or fortunately, thrown in favor of the Democrats for Wilson. So the votes ultimately go to Wilson and in favor of Wilson, and Wilson becomes president. Now it's interesting to see this happen because when we had the election, not the 2020 election, but the previous election, in 2016, I honestly had predicted to my students that I thought that was what was going to happen with the Republican Party, that they were going to split the ticket and throw the election in favor of the Democrats. But it didn't happen like I thought it was. So it's kind of interesting. I thought history was going to repeat itself because it looked like that Mitt Romney was going to enter the election and split the Republican ticket right down the middle. But it didn't happen. So it would have been interesting to see if that did happen, how the outcome would have been, if it would have been the same thing like the 1912 election. But ultimately, who wins the 1912 election is Woodrow Wilson. So with that, we've reached the end of chapter 19, and we will open chapter 20